A struggling farmer lends his horse to a traveler, unaware she's a billionaire seeking true love. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Rain had rolled in hard and sudden, like most things in the high plains. By the time Cole Bennett saw the headlights bobbing through the sheets of water, dusk had settled over the ranch, painting the Wyoming sky in bruised shades of purple and gold. He stood just inside the threshold of his barn, a weathered silhouette against the soft flicker of lantern light, his hand gently stroking the neck of Legend, his last stallion, a chestnut beast too proud to understand he might be the final heir to a vanishing legacy. Cole's jeans were soaked, his boots heavy with mud, but he didn't flinch when the truck door slammed and a figure stumbled toward the barn. She was drenched, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks, her steps hesitant as she held up a trembling hand. I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice breathless but controlled. I need to borrow a horse, just for a couple of days." "My car." Cole didn't answer immediately. He studied her through the rain, through the instinct that had kept him alive long after hope had thinned. She wasn't from here. Her shoes, even soaked, were too fine. Her coat, what remained of it, carried the ghost of designer lines. But her eyes, they were honest, frightened, and maybe something else, hollowed out in a way he recognized. "You ride?" he asked finally. She nodded. "Yes, not lately, but I was raised around horses." Cole motioned her inside. Legend snorted softly, sensing the storm behind her eyes more than the one raging outside. "Storm's not one you want to test," he said, pulling a blanket from a hook and handing it to her. "You can rest here. We'll talk horses in the morning." She hesitated, then stepped inside. Her limbs trembled as she wrapped herself in the wool blanket. "Thank you," she murmured. "I'm Vivian Langford." He offered a single nod. "Cole." They didn't say much more that night. So they didn't say much more that night. She slept in the hayloft above the quiet breath of animals, while he watched the lightning dance over the hills. A man too stubborn to let go, and too tired to keep fighting. The next morning dawned clear, the storm a memory painted in puddles. Vivian came down the ladder with straw in her hair and a question in her eyes. "You still want to ride out?" She nodded. "You can take Sage," Cole said, pointing to the dappled mare, gentle, sure-footed. Vivian approached the horse with reverence. She moved like someone remembering an old language, whispering soft words into the mare's ear as she fitted the bridle. Cole watched from the stall, arms crossed. "You've been around horses, sure enough," he said. "You from around these parts once?" "No," she answered too quickly, then smiled. "Just needed a change of scenery." That much was true. What she didn't say was that 2 nights ago she'd walked away from a boardroom stacked with men twice her age, all waiting to hear whether she'd approve a $40 billion merger. Instead, she'd vanished. She'd left her name, her phones, her tailored armor behind in San Francisco. She hadn't expected to find shelter in the arms of a collapsing barn. Over the next few days, Vivian became part of the ranch's rhythm. She helped with chores. She cooked simple meals and swept the porch. She learned to fix a leaky roof and how to cradle a newborn calf. And she watched Cole. He was the kind of man the world forgot to make anymore. Quiet, solid, with hands like stone and eyes like winter water. He spoke sparingly but listened fully. When he touched the horses, even the wildest of them still. And when he looked at her, really looked. She felt seen in a way no press release or award ever managed. Vivian found herself staying longer than she intended. Every day she told herself she'd leave tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. One afternoon, she caught sight of a past-due notice shoved between bills on the kitchen table. The ranch was behind on payments. The electric company threatened shut off. The bank's tone had turned final. She said nothing. She said nothing. That night, alone in the loft, she sent a single encrypted message through her old secure server. Divert funding. Local development grant. Rural preservation priority. Within 48 hours, the county clerk's office received a donation for agricultural revitalization. Untraceable, anonymous. The kind of help that looked like coincidence. Cole didn't believe in coincidence, but he didn't ask either. Someone must be watching out for me, he muttered when the bank called to renegotiate. Vivian smiled behind her coffee cup. Maybe you deserve it. One evening, while fixing the corral gate, their hands brushed. Neither pulled away. You ever think about staying? He asked. Her heart stuttered. I think about it every minute. But her eyes flicked toward the ridge where cell service sometimes crept in, and he saw it. He wasn't stupid. Her hands were too soft, her knowledge too vast. There were moments when she slipped and said things about platform scalability or user behavior curves. Words no ranch hand used. He had his suspicions. But he didn't press. Not yet. Not yet. Everything changed on a Wednesday. Vivian had ridden into town for supplies. Cole stayed to tend to a sick foal. The local diner was buzzing with news. Vivian Langford, the reclusive tech visionary, had disappeared. Rumors of scandal. Possible mental breakdown. Vivian froze. Her photo flashed across the diner's small television. When she returned to the ranch, Cole was waiting on the porch. He held her gaze. Vivian Langford, he said. Lo, should I have known that name? She stood in the fading light, her heart in her throat. You know me. That's all that matters. But he turned away, not angry, just hollow. She left the next morning. No note. Just a single red bandana tied to Sage's reins. Weeks passed. The ranch missed her in quiet ways. Empty coffee cups, unlaced boots, silence where there used to be laughter. Cole went back to routines. The ranch oddly held on. Donations trickled in. Programs started. A regional sustainability grant materialized, he knew. And it made everything more complicated. The first snow had just started to fall when a black truck came down the drive. Cole stepped onto the porch. Vivian stepped out. No designer coat. No designer coat. Just jeans, boots, and the red bandana tied around her wrist. You came back, he said. If you'll have me, she replied, her voice shaking. He didn't answer immediately, just reached for her hand and said, Come inside, it's cold. And just like that, the storm between them began to clear. In the barn that night, she whispered the whole truth about who she was. About the money, the help, the reason she ran. I came here to disappear, she said, eyes wet. But I found something worth showing up for. I want to build something real. With you. Cole didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, You already did. She stepped closer. Then let me stay. Not to save you, but to stand beside you. This time when he kissed her, it wasn't under false names or borrowed time. It was a beginning, honest, earned. Outside, snow blanketed the pastures, turning the broken into something beautiful. A second chance, built not on wealth or rescue, but on love, restored resilient and real. The weight of quiet things. A life lived in disguise. The first real snow arrived overnight, painting the wide Wyoming plains in silence and white. Cole Bennett stood on the porch of the ranch house with a steaming mug in hand. watching as the wind played gentle tricks with the flakes. Behind him, the old wood stove crackled and popped, filling the house with warmth and the scent of burning cedar. Inside, Vivian Langford, though no one here called her that anymore, was kneeling by the fire, coaxing a fresh log into place. She wore the same flannel Cole had lent her the night she arrived 2 months ago. It hung loose now, comfortably worn, like the person she'd become. Cole watched her for a long moment through the window. She still hadn't told him everything. Vivian had thrown herself into ranch life with a determination that startled even her. She rose before dawn, fed the calves, shoveled snow, and learned to wrap a halter with clumsy fingers that had once only known the click of a keyboard. She laughed when she tripped over a feed bucket and cursed under her breath when she couldn't start the tractor. And Cole, steady, kind, careful Cole, had never asked why a stranger with a city's worth of mystery in her eyes had wandered into his world. Not once, which somehow made it harder. One late afternoon, Vivian stood in the pasture, arms folded, watching the yearlings chase each other through the snow. A soft nudge on her shoulder made her turn. Cole handed her a thermos. "Hot cider," he said. "Figured you needed it more than me." Their fingers brushed, just briefly. "But enough. Thanks," she said, and meant more than just the cider. He looked out at the horizon, that soft amber light that only winter seemed to cast. "You've got good hands," he said. "Careful, but not afraid of the mess." Vivian smiled. High praise from a man who can fix a tractor with a hammer and duct tape. Don't knock duct tape. Saved more marriages than counseling. They laughed together, and for a moment the tension that clung around her shoulders, like the secrets she kept, lifted. Later that evening, Cole brought out an old photo album. They sat on the floor of the living room, boots off, socks warm, cider half gone. The photos were faded, sepia-toned snapshots of ranch life, of cattle drives, snowy Christmases, and a younger Cole in the arms of a laughing woman. "My late wife, Clara," he said, voice quiet. Vivian studied the picture. "She looks like she loved hard." She did. He closed the album gently. "Didn't know if I'd ever feel that again. Still not sure." Vivian stared at the fire, the weight of her real identity pressing against her ribs. The names she'd left behind, the billions, the boardrooms, the headlines that had turned cold in her absence. And yet here she was something she hadn't been in years. Honest, even if only on the surface. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Outside, a coyote howled. Somewhere in the house, the floorboards creaked like an old whisper. She'd never meant to stay this long, but she couldn't imagine leaving. The moment she couldn't take back 3 days later, a storm rolled in, fierce and sudden. Cole was out in the north pasture when the wind kicked up. Vivian didn't think twice. She pulled on her coat and rode out, fear curling in her chest like frostbite. She found him in the snow, coaxing a frightened calf from a ditch. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, squinting through the flurries. "And let you freeze to death?" She snapped, teeth chattering. Together they wrestled the calf onto the saddle blanket. Snow swirled. Vivian slipped. Cole caught her. For a second their faces were inches apart. "Don't scare me like that," she said. "I could say the same." He leaned in, slow, hesitant, and kissed her. Not a fiery kiss, but one full of warmth and hunger for peace, for trust. Back at the barn, drying off, she almost told him. Almost, but the words stuck like splinters. The truth didn't come from her. It came from the mail. A week later, Cole returned from town with a newspaper, folded and crumpled in his calloused hand. The front page headline read, "Harris turned ghost, Langford Tech CEO still missing." The photo was unmistakable. Vivian in her prime, hair swept up, red lipstick, steely eyes behind smart glasses. A woman who looked nothing like the one cooking stew in his kitchen. Cole stood in the doorway, silent. Vivian turned, apron dusted with flour. She saw the paper, saw his face, and knew. "How long?" he asked. She opened her mouth, closed it, then said, "Since the night I showed up." He didn't yell, didn't accuse, just walked outside. The next morning, the barn was cold. The chores were done without words. At lunch, he finally said, "Was any of it real?" Vivian placed a bowl of stew in front of him. "Every moment, except my name. I trusted you," he said, his voice a gravel road of pain. "I know," she whispered, "and I never lied about how I felt. About you, about this place. I just didn't think I'd accept you if you were rich." Vivian blinked back tears. Cole looked away. "You might be right." She left that evening. Packed her things into the old truck she'd borrowed. Left a note on the kitchen table that said only, "I wasn't running from power. I was running to something real. I hope you find it again. Even if it's not with me." But the ranch wasn't the same without her. And neither was he. 2 weeks later, a knock on Cole's door startled him from sleep. He opened it to find a man in a pressed jacket holding a folder. "Yours is the first on her list." Cole stared at him, then at the folder. Inside, funds, proposals, plans, all under a name she had never spoken aloud in his presence. But it wasn't the money that made his throat tight. It was the handwritten note tucked in the back. "If the land can forgive my footprints, maybe you can forgive my heart. V." Spring melted the snow, and with it, something in Cole thawed, too. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he drove into town, parked beside the train station, waited. She stepped off the train in boots and denim. Her eyes searched the crowd and then stopped. On him, Cole tipped his hat. "I'm not here to buy anything," she said, heart in her throat. "I know," he replied. "I know," he replied. "I just came back to see if there's still a place for me. Not as Vivian Langford, just as me." He looked at her for a long time, then said, "The ranch is short one hand. The horses have been moody. The coffee's been terrible." Vivian exhaled, naffed, nearly cried. "So," Cole said, "you coming home?" She nodded. "If you'll let me." And he did, this time with no disguise, no secrets, just open skies, open hearts, and the long healing work of building something real together. Love built on trust and simplicity. The Wyoming sky stretched endlessly, a canvas of soft blues and wisps of white, as Cole Bennett guided Vivian Langford through the art of mending a weathered fence. Their hands worked in tandem, the rhythmic clinking of metal on wood punctuating the serene morning. Vivian's once pristine hands, now calloused and strong, mirrored the transformation she had undergone since arriving at the ranch. As days turned into weeks, their partnership deepened. Cole taught Vivian the subtle language of the land, how to read the sky for impending storms, the gentle art of coaxing a skittish calf, and the unspoken bond between a rider and her horse. In return, Vivian offered insights from her past life, suggesting innovative yet simple solutions to age-old farming challenges. Their evenings were filled with shared stories, laughter echoing through the modest ranch house, and moments of comfortable silence that spoke volumes. One crisp evening, under a canopy of stars, Cole led Vivian to the barn's open space. With a shy smile, he extended his hand. "May I have this dance?" he asked. Surprised, Vivian nodded, and they swayed to the melody of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. The world narrowed to the warmth of their closeness, the gentle pressure of Cole's hand on her back, and the unspoken promises in their locked eyes. As autumn painted the landscape in hues of amber and gold, their bond blossomed into a love rooted in mutual respect and shared purpose. Yet beneath the surface, Vivian wrestled with a growing unease. She had built this new life on the foundation of omission, withholding the truth of her identity as a tech billionaire seeking refuge from a world that had become suffocating. Each day that passed, the weight of her secret pressed heavier on her heart. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Cole spoke, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "Vivian, I've been meaning to ask, what brought you here? To this ranch, to this life?" Vivian's breath caught. The moment she had both anticipated and dreaded had arrived. She turned to face Cole, her eyes searching his. "Cole, there's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice trembling. She unfolded her story, the high-powered meetings, the relentless demands, the feeling of being trapped in a gilded cage. She spoke of the night she left it all behind, seeking solace and authenticity in the simplicity of ranch life. Tears welled as she confessed, "I was afraid that if you knew who I really was, you'd see me different. That this," she gestured between them, "would change." Cole listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, silence enveloped them. Vivian's heart pounded as she awaited his response. Finally, Cole spoke, his voice steady. "Vivian, I fell in love with the woman who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, who faced each challenge with determination and grace. Your past doesn't change that. But trust doesn't change that. But trust is built on honesty. I wish you'd told me sooner." Relief and sorrow mingled in Vivian's chest. "I understand if you need time," she whispered. Cole reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "We've built something real here. Let's not let secrets unravel it." In the days that followed, they worked side by side, mending not just fences but the fragile threads of trust. Their love, tested by truth, emerged stronger, a testament to the resilience of two hearts, willing to embrace both the past and the promise of a shared future. Love at the edge of truth. The Wyoming wind carried a chill, but inside the old barn, wind carried a chill. But inside, warmth crackled in the air, not from the modest space heater in the corner, but from the fire of something more fragile, more dangerous, unspoken truth. Vivian Langford stood at the workbench, pretending to sand the edge of an already smooth cedar plank, her gaze flickering now and again to where Cole Bennett crouched by the stalled door, tending to a limping calf. Every moment she spent here made it harder to keep the secret. The grants she'd whispered into motion, the debt quietly wiped clean through shadowed intermediaries, the bank that had mysteriously granted the ranch a 6-month reprieve. She hadn't meant to play puppet master. She just wanted to help without tainting what they were building with the weight of who she used to be. Cole rose and stretched, rubbing the back of his neck. "That little one's gonna be all right," he said, brushing hay from his flannel sleeve. "Sometimes all they need is a bit of warmth and a steady hand." Vivian forced a smile. "And what about us?" she wanted to ask. "Can we survive what's coming?" He crossed to her, brushing sawdust from her shoulder. "You okay? You've been quiet today." "Just thinking," she said. He nodded, trusting as ever. She swallowed hard. The guilt felt like a splinter under her skin. Later that evening, as twilight wrapped the ranch in indigo shadow, Vivian sat on the porch steps with a mug of coffee cradled between her hands. The horizon stretched endless before her, but it was the past closing in. She could hear her phone buzzing in the nightstand drawer upstairs. The phone she hadn't touched in weeks, the one with the press inquiries and panicked messages from a board scrambling to find their missing CEO. "Beautiful night," Cole said as he joined her, holding out a second mug. Their fingers brushed. "I don't deserve this," she whispered before she could stop herself. He frowned, settling beside her. "What do you mean?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. The words tangled in her throat. She couldn't do it, not yet. He wrapped an arm around her. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. She leaned into him, aching with the knowledge that she hadn't earned that trust. That night, she crept out of bed and powered on the phone. The screen came alive with headlines. Langford disappearance prompts board crisis. Langford Tech shares dip amid CEO's mysterious absence. She scrolled past the chaos until she found what she needed. She made a call. Yes, she said, voice low. Set up the investment, quietly. Funnel it through the Wyoming Ag Development Fund. No names. And pull the media off the scent. I need more time. The next morning, Cole found her by the barn early, already mucking stalls. You're up before me, he teased. Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd make myself useful. He grinned, but she could see the questions behind his eyes. A storm was building, not just in the clouds, but in her heart. And soon she knew it would break. The Wyoming sky had been brooding all day, heavy with the promise of a storm. Vivian Langford stood by the kitchen window, watching the horizon darken, the wind picking up in restless gusts. Her heart mirrored the weather, turbulent, unsettled. Cole Bennett entered, wiping his hands on a rag. Looks like we're in for a rough one, he said, nodding toward the gathering clouds. Vivian turned to him, concern etching her features. Is there anything we need to do to prepare? He gave her a reassuring smile. Just the usual. Secure the livestock, make sure everything's tied down. He paused, studying her. You okay? She nodded, forcing a smile. Just a little anxious, I guess. He stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. We'll get through it, like we always do. As the first drops of rain spattered against the windows, they donned their rain gear and headed outside. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of ozone and earth. Together, they moved through the motions of securing the ranch, their actions synchronized from months of working side by side. They reached the pasture where the cattle had begun to mill about, sensing the approaching tempest. Cole shouted over the rising wind, We need to get them to the lower field, where it's more sheltered. Vivian nodded, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. They worked in tandem, guiding the nervous animals through the gate, their movements efficient despite the chaos around them. A sudden crack split the air as a nearby tree succumbed to the wind, falling across the path behind them. Vivian's heart leapt into her throat, but she pushed down the fear, focusing on the task at hand. Hours later, drenched and exhausted, they secured the last of the equipment in the barn. Cole turned to Vivian, his eyes reflecting the dim light. That's the best we can do. Let's get inside before it gets worse. Inside the house, they peeled off their wet clothes, hanging them by the fire to dry. Vivian wrapped herself in a blanket, shivering as the adrenaline ebbed. Cole handed her a mug of hot coffee, his fingers lingering on hers for a moment, longer than necessary. You did good out there, he said softly. She met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. I couldn't have done it without you. He chuckled, a warm, comforting sound. We're a team, remember? As the storm raged outside, they sat together by the fire, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger. In the face of nature's fury, they had found a deeper connection, one forged in trust and resilience. Vivian leaned her head on Cole's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that together they could weather any storm. The silence on the ranch was different now. It wasn't the gentle hush of a Wyoming sunrise, or the peaceful stillness after a long day's work. This silence was heavier, denser, thick with all the things left unsaid. The storm that had torn through the land days ago had left branches broken, fences down, and water pooled in low fields. But it was the storm of truth. Vivian's truth that had done the most damage. Cole hadn't spoken to her since the morning after. He'd ridden out early, taking the far pasture, then the western ridge. Always somewhere she wasn't. And Vivian, once so sure of her footing in the rhythm of ranch life, now moved like a ghost, a visitor in a world she'd come to love too deep. The news had broken with the efficiency only wealth and curiosity could ensure. A drone photo, a misidentified travel permit, then a journalist with a long lens and an obsession with fallen royalty. Vivian Langford, the reclusive billionaire, the mind behind 3 of the decade's most disruptive innovations, hiding out as a ranch hand in Wyoming. By the time it aired on the morning news, her photo had already spread across social media. She had tried to explain, tried to find the words to tell Cole that she hadn't come to deceive, that she'd only wanted to be somewhere real, to be someone real, but by then the wound was open, and words only seemed to salt it. "You came here wanting something true," Cole had said that morning, his voice low and raw. "And you couldn't even tell me your name." She'd wanted to reach for him, to bridge the inches that felt like miles. But his eyes had hardened, and he'd turned away before she could answer. Now the barn creaked in the wind. The windmill spun slowly. The horses sensed it all, restless and uneasy. Vivian sat on the porch steps, the same place she'd first heard Cole laugh. Her hands were blistered still from the storm work, her muscles sore in the way she'd grown to cherish. But the ache in her chest drowned all else. She had to leave. She had to leave. The media would only circle closer. The ranch was vulnerable enough without cameras and questions. She stood, brushing hay from her jeans, and walked to the paddock. Cole was there, tightening a fence post. He didn't look up as she approached. "I'm leaving in the morning," she said softly. The hammer paused mid-swing. "Not because I want to. Because I have to." Still no reply. "This place deserves peace. And you deserve honesty. I can't undo the way I came here, Cole, but I can stop doing more harm." He finally returned, slow and deliberate. His eyes were tired, hurt still, but less sharp now. "So that's it? You run again?" Vivian swallowed. "No, not running. Just trying not to trample over something good that doesn't need any more damage." A long pause stretched between them. Then, "Quieter," he asked. "Was any of it real?" She stepped closer. "All of it." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the flicker of the man who'd once shared coffee with her under a cottonwood tree. "Then don't go," she blinked. "Wah!" He stood fully now. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat. "You lied," he said, not unkindly, "and that hurt. But you stayed during the storm. You worked harder than most folks ever will. You looked at this place like it meant something, not because you could buy it, but because you belonged in it." He stepped closer. "I was mad, Viv. Still am a little. But love doesn't disappear just because truth shows up late. You make this place better. You make me better." She opened her mouth, then closed it, overwhelmed. "I want to believe you," he said. "But you're gonna have to help me build that trust back, nail by nail." Vivian nodded, eyes stinging. "I can do that. I want to." He reached for her hand. She took it. "I want to." He reached for her hand. She took it, and for the first time since the headlines broke, the wind didn't feel quite so cold. They stood like that for a long while. A rancher and a runaway, hands clasped in the open air, where secrets had once lived, and now, finally, truth could breathe. Not everything could be repaired overnight. Fences would still need mending. Trust would take time. But love, like land, could heal if tended with care. And together they were learning how to tend it right. The morning light over Wyoming was pale and tentative, as if unsure whether it should wake the land. But within the Langford boardroom in San Francisco, Vivian Langford stood tall, voice steady as she addressed a row of skeptical executives. "Gentlemen," she said, fingers spread on the table, looking each of them in the eye, "it's time we stop pretending that success has to come from skyscrapers and saturated markets. Real innovation, lasting legacy, can be found in places most of you have never bothered to look." Behind her, images flicked across a sleek monitor. Sweeping prairie grass, weathered barns, livestock silhouetted by sunrises, a man riding bareback across a misty ridge. Cole. But she didn't say his name. Not yet. "We have the opportunity to lead the next frontier. Sustainable rural development. This isn't a pet project. It's a pivot, and it starts with one ranch in Wyoming." The room was silent. Then came the pushback. "Our investors will balk. You disappeared. How can we trust you now?" "This sounds sentimental, Vivian." She met their doubt with calm steel. "I left because I couldn't recognize myself anymore. I came back because I finally do." Silence again, and then a single nod from the elder statesman on the board. "Show us the numbers, Langford. If it adds up, we'll back your plan." 3 weeks later, the pilot was approved. Back in Wyoming, the prairie was still bruised from the storm. Downed fences, torn-up pasture, a barn roof that still bore a ragged scar. Cole had thrown himself into repairs with quiet intensity, accepting neighborly help but saying little. He hadn't spoken to Vivian since that morning she'd stood on the porch and offered to tell him the truth. He'd walked away until the letters started coming. First, a grant confirmation, then an application approval for a rural development program he hadn't submitted. Finally, a letter from the Department of Agriculture commending Langford Ranch for being selected as a sustainable innovation pilot site. Cole had stared at the Langford name in the header, heart pounding. He crumpled the letter and tossed it in the bin, and then 2 days later she returned. Not in a black car, not with an entourage or cameras, just Vivian, flannel shirt, jeans, and the same dusty boots she'd worn that first night. She waited at the gate, didn't cross it, just stood there until Cole finally, slowly, emerged from the barn. They stared at each other across the fence line. "I came to say thank you," she began. "Not to pitch, not to ask, just to thank you for teaching me what real looks like." He didn't speak. "I didn't lie to hurt you, Cole. I lied because I was afraid. Afraid I was nothing without the money, the name. But out here, you saw me before I saw myself." She handed him a folder. Inside were detailed plans. Crop rotation paired with drone imaging, local apprenticeships, solar irrigation integration. It was thoughtful, respectful, no corporate bulldozing. "It's your ranch, Cole, always. This is just a way to protect it, and others like it. Still," he said nothing. Vivian turned to leave. I read every page. It was good work, honest work. Vivian turned back slowly, hope flickering. "You should stay for dinner," he added. She did. They ate at the kitchen table just like before, though quieter this time. Afterward, they walked the fence line. No declarations, just the soft rebuilding of something fragile and real. By spring, the Langford Initiative was officially launched. Drones mapped the fields, but Cole still walked them at dawn. High schoolers came on Saturdays, learning how to code and muck stalls. Vivian split her time between the ranch and the new field office in town, her heels traded permanently for boots. Trust returned slowly, not in grand gestures, but in quiet ones. A second coffee mug beside the thermos, a shared glance when the foal finally stood, a dance on the porch to a crackling radio. When the first harvest under the new plan came in stronger than any in 5 years, Cole surprised everyone by organizing a community potluck. Vivian cooked. No one batted an eye when she served pie with calloused hands. Later that night, beneath strings of lights hung between the barn beams, Cole finally took her hand again. "This life," he said quietly. "I didn't know I was waiting for it." Vivian leaned into his shoulder, her heart full. "Neither did I. Love, real love, isn't about perfection. It's about truth." And finally, they were living it together. The prairie, once on the brink, now bloomed, not just with wildflowers and wheat, but with a new kind of hope. And in its heart stood a rancher and a visionary who dared to rebuild not just a ranch, but a Wyoming. The Wyoming sky bloomed with soft amber light as the first rays of dawn crept over the Bennett ranch. Cole stood at the edge of the newly repaired paddock, the wind tousling his hair, his hand resting on the wooden fence still rough with fresh sawdust. Behind him, the sound of hooves broke the morning hush. Vivian approaching, reins in hand, a quiet smile playing at the corners of her lips. She dismounted beside him, brushing a wisp of hair from her cheek, her boots caked with honest dirt. No longer the polished heiress in hiding, she moved like she belonged here, because now she did. "Fence held through the night," she said, running her hand along the top beam. "No sign of the post giving." Cole nodded, but his gaze stayed on her, thoughtful. "It's holding better than I thought it would." He wasn't talking about the fence. It had been a week since their agreement. Not just to save the ranch, but to rebuild it side by side. Vivian had returned with contracts, plans, and resources most could only dream of, but she hadn't led with her checkbook. She'd stood on his porch and asked to be his partner. In life, in the land, and for once, Cole had let someone in. They worked until the sun crested the hills, checking irrigation valves, noting areas where winter feed needed reseeding, and cataloging aging equipment. But there was laughter too, real, easy laughter, as Vivian teased Cole for underestimating her fence-measuring skills, and he pretended to grumble about her spreadsheets titled Bale Optimization Model. By midday, the warmth of their effort radiated through more than just the fields. Together, they hosted their first community meeting in the old hayloft, swept and transformed into a gathering space. Word had spread quickly that something was happening at Bennett Ranch. Curiosity drew neighbors, skeptics, and old friends. Cole opened the meeting with a few words. "Most of you'll know this place has seen better days. So have I. But we're not giving up. Not yet." Then he stepped aside. Vivian, in worn jeans and a cotton blouse, stood before the crowd. No podium, no pretense. She spoke of sustainability, of integrating technology without stripping tradition. She told them about soil sensors and AI crop rotation, but she grounded it in something deeper. "This isn't about replacing anything," she said, voice steady. "It's about honoring what works and helping it survive in a world that changes faster than it should. It's about giving our children a reason to stay." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. And then came the questions about cost, ownership, trust. Vivian answered each with transparency, offering joint ownership structures, local training programs, and a promise. No family would be left behind. When the meeting ended, it wasn't handshakes that sealed the mood. It was the way people lingered, talking again like they had before drought and debt had made them retreat. Hope was returned. That night, Cole and Vivian sat on the porch, 2 mugs of coffee between them, legs brushing under the quilt she'd brought from the cabin. The stars blinked overhead. "You were good today," Cole said, sipping from his mug. "So were you." "You didn't even flinch when old Roy asked if you were finally proposing." He chuckled. "He's been trying to marry me off for years." Vivian glanced at him, serious now. "Do you ever think we might grow this beyond the ranch?" He turned to her. "You mean what we're building here?" "Yeah, the network. Community-based farming, powered by tradition and tech. It could change things, really change them. Cole thought for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand. "One field at a time, partner." The next morning they walked through the field together, boots in step, future unfolding beneath each footfall. And in the golden hush of morning, surrounded by land they'd chosen to believe in again, Cole leaned in and kissed Vivian softly, not out of passion, but promise. What they were building wasn't just a ranch. It was a new way forward, a legacy born not from wealth or pride, but from courage, truth, and the quiet miracle of love that grew strong under wide open skies. By late spring, wildflowers colored the Wyoming pastures in shades of violet and gold, and the Bennett Langford Ranch, once teetering on the edge of foreclosure, now thrummed with life and purpose. Drones hovered gently over crops, collecting soil data. Solar panels gleamed beside a barn still proudly weathered by time. A new building, half glass, half reclaimed wood, stood at the edge of the property, housing the headquarters of their growing initiative. Inside, a group of local teenagers were gathered around a touchscreen display, watching how AI-powered weather forecasts helped plan irrigation. Beside them, Cole stood with one hand on the back of a chair, the other holding a mug of coffee. He wasn't much for computers, but he knew the land, and he could see the shift happening before his eyes. "I used to think all this technology would replace what I knew," he said to the teens. "But turns out it just listens better than most folks ever did." Laughter echoed in the room. Even now, he never spoke more than necessary, but every word landed like it had roots. Vivian watched from the doorway, heart full. She'd returned not to fix Cole's world, but to belong in it. The initiative had grown beyond them now, 56 farms and counting. Their pilot program stretched from the cornfields of Iowa to the vineyards of Northern California. But this place, this ranch, remained the soul of it all. It wasn't just the soil that had changed, it was the people. The town of Larkspur Ridge had rallied, rebuilt, and bloomed. The feed store expanded. The school reopened its agriculture tech wing. Martha's Diner started serving smart beef, a nod to ranchers using tech to enhance animal welfare and sustainability. One afternoon, as the wind chased cotton clouds across the prairie, Cole and Vivian stood beneath the old windmill that had turned over generations of Bennett sunrises. "We've come a long way from that rainstorm," Vivian said, brushing her hand against his. "You still owe me for a saddle blanket," Cole teased. She laughed, the kind of laugh that still made his chest feel both light and heavy. "I'm building you an empire and you're worried about a saddle blanket." "I'm not worried," he said softly. "I just like reminding you how it all started." Vivian reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Cole unfolded it, eyes scanning the blueprint. It was for a new wing of the initiative, a legacy program named after his mother, June Bennett, who had once taught farming to the children of migrant workers. "She taught with her hands and her heart," Vivian said. "This center will teach both." Cole blinked a few times. "She'd have liked you. She'd have scared me." Vivian smiled. That night, they sat on the porch, shoulder to shoulder, as a symphony of frogs and crickets rose from the creek. The stars came out slowly, one by one, like blessings whispered into the dark. "Sometimes," Cole said, "I forget you used to own a jet." Vivian leaned her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes I forget too." He looked at her then, not the heiress, not the CEO, but the woman who had mucked his stalls and dared to ask for a horse in the middle of a storm. She had traded high-rises for haylofts, profits for purpose. She had chosen him, and this place over everything she'd once built. The silence between them was full, the way only two people who'd fought through heartbreak and found grace again could share. 6 months later, they stood at the groundbreaking of the June Bennett Learning Barn, surrounded by students, families, reporters, and farmers from across the country. Vivian, dressed in worn jeans and boots, took the microphone. Cameras clicked, drones buzzed, but she looked only at Cole. "I once believed success was measured in numbers," she began. "Shares, mergers, headlines. But standing here on this land, I learned a new definition. Success is measured in second chances, in sunrises shared, in courage to love after loss, in planting something that might not bloom for years, but doing it anyway." Tears welled in more than one eye. Cole joined her, speaking the way he always did, slow, sure, and straight to the heart. This ranch was built by folks who believed in things they'd never lived to see. "What we're doing now, it's for the next ones. The kids who will run this land after we're gone. If we can give them something worth holding on to, that's enough for me." They broke ground together, their hands side by side on the same wooden-handled shovel. And as cheers erupted, the wind carried petals from the wildflowers across the prairie like confetti from heaven. Later that night, back on the porch, Vivian leaned against Cole as fireflies danced beyond the fence line. "We did it," she whispered. "No," Cole corrected, kissing her temple. "We're doing it. Still more fences to mend, more kids to teach, more lives to build." She smiled. "Then I hope it takes forever." He looked down at her, eyes full of quiet fire. "Me too." The windmill creaked in the breeze, and somewhere out in the pasture, a calf bleated for its mother. Life, imperfect and beautiful, kept moving forward. And under that vast Wyoming sky, with dust on their boots and love in their bones, Cole and Vivian held each other. Two lives, two worlds, one enduring promise. Seasons of the heart. The first snow came early that year, drifting across the Wyoming plains like a whispered promise. Under the vast hush of winter, the Bennett Langford Ranch slowed its pace. Machines rested beneath canvas tarps. Horses were blanketed and fed. In the farmhouse kitchen, the kettle sang its familiar tune as Vivian stood by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug, watching the light fade over the hills. Married life hadn't changed them. It had deepened them. Cole still rose before dawn, his boots thudding softly across the old wood floor. But now there were 2 steaming mugs in the morning and a second coat hanging on the peg. Vivian, once the elusive visionary behind global boardrooms, had found rhythm in barn chores and board meetings alike. She moved between conference calls and calf feedings with a grace that surprised even herself. What they'd built wasn't just a marriage or a ranch. It was a home that held both grit and grace. On the ranch's southern slope, a new wing had been added to the barn, a warm workshop where veterans and out-of-work tradespeople came to rebuild both furniture and their sense of self. The restoration room, Vivian called it. Cole just called it sacred. Each chair crafted there carried more than wood grain and varnish. It held stories. Hands that once trembled with memory now shaped walnut and pine with purpose. And every Saturday, without fail, Cole and Vivian hosted a long wooden table dinner where engineers from Denver sat beside ranchers from down the road, where stories spilled as easily as gravy and laughter rose like music through the rafters. But winter deepened. A new challenge stirred, quieter than storms, but no less dangerous. Vivian's mother, Evelyn Langford, had been watching from afar. A matriarch of ice and ambition, she'd built the Langford name into a brand synonymous with success. When news of the Bennett Langford initiative began to make national headlines, farms saved, lives changed, technology harnessed for good, She booked a private flight to Wyoming without warning. She arrived on a wind-bitten morning, stepping out of a sleek black car in heels entirely unsuited for gravel. Cole met her at the gate, arms crossed, wary. Vivian, apron dusted with flour, emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands. "Mother," she said quietly. "Vivian," Evelyn replied, eyeing the porch, the barn, the modesty of it all. "So this is where you've hidden yourself." "I haven't hidden yourself. I haven't hidden," Vivian said. "I've finally come home." The days that followed were tense. Evelyn disapproved of nearly everything. The chickens wandering freely, the scent of manure, the lack of espresso. But mostly, she disapproved of what her daughter had become. Soft-spoken, soil-stained, radiant with a kind of peace Evelyn couldn't name. "I gave you the world," she said over dinner one night. Seated stiffly in the old dining chair, Cole had restored himself. "No, Mother," Vivian said gently, her hand finding Cole's beneath the table. "You gave me the tools to build mine. I just didn't know what that meant until I came here." Evelyn looked at Cole, then back at her daughter. "You think this is enough? Chickens, cows, Sunday suppers?" Vivian didn't raise her voice. She simply stood, walked to the window, and gestured toward the barn. "That man you're looking down on, he gave a name to something I couldn't buy. Belonging, purpose, love, without condition." Silence stretched long, and then Evelyn did something Vivian hadn't seen since childhood. She wept. The following morning, she asked to tour the restoration room. She spent hours speaking with a retired carpenter who'd been sleeping in his truck before the program began. That evening, she offered a quiet toast at the table, her voice unsteady. "To my daughter," she said, "who reminds me that legacy is not just what we build in the world, but who we become when the world is stripped away." Winter thawed into spring. The ranch bloomed in subtle ways. Calves tottered through meadows. Solar panels gleamed on the tool shed roof. And Vivian, now a frequent name in both agricultural and tech journals, never once used a title other than co-director when introducing herself. One crisp morning, as Cole mended a fence and Vivian led a workshop on rural tech integration, a small group of reporters arrived, unexpected but respectful. They weren't looking for a scoop. They'd heard whispers of a place where two worlds met and grew something new. They asked what the secret was. Cole, wiping his hands on his jeans, looked over at Vivian. She was laughing with a teenager who'd just installed his first solar water pump. She caught his gaze and smiled, the kind that said, "We made it." He turned back to the reporter. "We don't aim to be perfect, just honest. And when you lead with that, well, good things have a way of growing." By summer, the ranch hosted its first intergenerational summit. Farmers over 60 teaching coding interns how to plant by the signs of the moon, while tech-savvy youth showed ranchers how to fly crop-monitoring drones. A quiet moment came one night after the summit's closing campfire. Cole and Vivian stood under a sky dusted with stars, their hands entwined, the hum of new voices drifting from the guest bunkhouse. "Did you ever think," Cole whispered, "that all this would come from one borrowed horse?" Vivian laughed softly. "I think about it every day." He drew her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "If I had to do it all again, the storm, the truth, the heartbreak, I would, if it brought me to this moment with you." Vivian blinked back tears. "Me too." And so the seasons turned. The Bennett Langford Ranch thrived, not just in yield but in meaning. And while the world marveled at what they'd built, Cole and Vivian knew the truth. It wasn't just the programs or the press or the movement they'd inspired. It was the life they lived, slow, intentional, rooted in care. A love written not in fairy tales, but in fence posts, flower-dusted aprons, and second chances. Dusted aprons and second chances. And every morning, as the sun rose over the plains, Vivian Langford Bennett stepped onto the porch, wrapped in her husband's old coat, and whispered a quiet vow. Here I am exactly where I belong. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Are you tuning in from the heartland of America, a quiet countryside, or maybe a bustling city dreaming of open fields? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, inspired you, or simply gave you a moment of warmth in your day, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another uplifting story like this. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.